Anecdotes of Reddit presents people who grew up in neighborhoods controlled by the mafia. Egg. New York in the 60s to 80s. How was your real daily life influenced? Overall it was pretty good. The neighborhood was always clean and taken care of. New York City sanitation snowplows would clear the streets constantly during a snowstorm. The sanitation workers would manually shovel the sidewalks of our block. Meanwhile, the news is reporting people being snowed in and city plows are not showing up. It wasn't until I got older that this wasn't the norm. Also, guys in bespoke suits hanging out during traditional working hours wasn't a norm as well. My parents would tell me not to go into certain stores or walk on certain streets. At the time I didn't fully grasp the reasoning behind the rules. I thought the guys in bespoke suits were nice, since they always would gather kids and family around a Mr. Softy ice cream truck for free desserts during summer evenings. I never saw any beatings or hits. I heard a lot of get out to here kid, be smart, stay in school and drugs are for weak-minded people. I guess you can say it's more like a Bronx Tale than it was Godfather or Casino. Don't forget to smash that like button so we can beat the YouTube algorithm. It really helps the channel. I have friends who grew up in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. One of them told me as he was growing up there, he would see guys walking around wearing suits, kissing each other on their cheeks, doing the whole Godfather thing. They also bought up all the properties in the neighborhood, making it impossible for non-Italians to buy real estate, but they let my friend's family do it because they wanted to open a Chinese restaurant and the Italians wanted to be able to go out for Chinese. There were Genovese drugstores everywhere too, that is owned by the Genovese crime family, and my friends would shop there. The mafia is a lot less active there now though. I hike most of them have moved to New Jersey. My mother was a bartender at a restaurant/bar in Boston. Sometimes she would bring me in the late afternoons for a Shirley Temple. I would sit with the men in dapper suits. They were wonderful to me and loved my mother. They nicknamed her Sunny. They were always genuinely interested in what was going on in my life, school, friends, activities, etc. I loved to visit with them and was enamored by their kindness towards my mother. I had never seen such strong men in my life at the time and wished one of them would be my father. I wasn't aware of their goings on until I was around 12 years old. I was a night owl and would eavesdrop on conversations. Her only true confidant was her sister, who worked at the same place. I heard her say that they had offered to kill my father, who had left her when I was a baby, but would come over every couple weeks and beat everyone up. She was crying and said she begged them not to hurt him, but they told her they were going to break his knees. My mother killed herself some years later. A time went by. My father had an accident. Both his legs below the knees were shattered and he had to retire from the police force. I've always wondered. The stuff in New York in the 70s and 80s was not really like a huge mafia war zone. It was more like a lot of financial rackets, corrupt unions, and various schemes. Thuggy street drug gangs were far more dangerous to the average person. I grew up in New York, on the other side of the Hudson from the city, and while the presence wasn't like what I imagine it is in the city, it was there. Where we lived, it was a lot of houses that were decently spaced from each other in the foothills of the Catskills, with a lot of people I called uncle or cousin that came around maybe once every week or two and were amazingly cool to me. They all ate and drank at my aunt's restaurant when they were there. They always had change for me for the jukebox to go buy a record or Mad or Cracked or whatever. When I made my first communion, it was a haul. I didn't get it then, but they laid out some bucks buying me all kinds of gold crosses, rings, necklaces with medallions of my patron saint, etc. Every Christmas or birthday was like that. No one broke into houses in our neighborhood, even though there was a problem with that in the general area. Snowplows always hit our streets right away. Even when there was a strike, our garbage got picked up. When my mom was in the hospital with cancer and my dad was visiting her as much as possible, somehow our lawn was always done. Meals were delivered to the house daily. Laundry was done. I was always looked after by someone. We moved when I was 9, 1979, but years later before my grandma died, she had one of those honest talks with me and laid out how both my mother and father's side of the family were back to 1920s, and that my dad was basically legit because his father demanded that. But that said, as an accountant, He still cooked the books for a lot of illegitimate businesses. I also found out then the reason my dad moved us down south then was that I was getting to an age I would soon put things together, and he didn't want that. Last I ever saw of any of those people from New York was when my dad passed, and two guys not much older than me showed up and gave me an envelope with about $12K in it to help with funeral expenses. I said it was covered by insurance, and the one I remember being named Tommy said then keep the scoots for yourself. The mob ran Youngstown, Ohio for decades. When I was growing up in the 90s is when they started to really getting torn apart. The power vacuum is what is really the weird part. These illegal businesses don't just go away because the ones running it get taken down. So there was a lot of gang violence when I was young as rivals tried to capitalize the drug, gun, and gambling markets. It kinda just became corruption at one point. Public officials / workers getting indicted left and right. Our congressman, Jim Traficant, was embroiled in bribery scandals for the 8th time, only slightly exaggerated. That's when the FBI showed up at my house looking for my dad. He was in Florida and my mom told them to come back with a warrant. I knew we were always around some shady shit. That was the confirmation. I was 13. 2 of his friends went to jail, 2 more indicted, and 1 received immunity to flip. Lived next to the Russian mafia growing up. Anyone who was Russian would always say I know someone, but in reality, there were a lot of lower tiered people who did collections and these were the people they were talking about. There were fights and you saw people go into stores and just go to the back who obviously didn't work there, and you know, that store was into shady shit, but it didn't involve you so who cares. There were occasional hits in the neighborhood, but living near Coney Island there was worse violence in the poor areas. If anything, you could walk down the streets at 3 AM and not worry, because if you were not involved in anything you were left alone and the locals policed themselves. My grandma grew up in the Bronx as a kid, and she told me that she never felt unsafe walking anywhere or doing anything because some of the members of the mafia would be around / live in her neighborhood and they'd always be there to help her out if she ran into trouble, kinda like a mafia neighborhood watch lol. My grandfather ran for political office against a mobster in Jersey back in the day, and while he was out for dinner with my grandmother the restaurant got shot up in a drive-by. He had multiple incidents at his home of windows being smashed and threatening notes being left around. He did not win the position. I'm not sure if the mobster did or not. Honestly not really sure how it all ended. My mom would never go into too much detail other than it happened in the past is the past. Grew up in Brooklyn in the late 60s early 70s, but moved away when I was 9. Only thing I really remember is a guy on our block named Teddy who even then I could tell was some kind of low-level gangster. Drove a Corvette Stingray, and when it got stolen one day had a new one in a different color the next day. He also had a dog, a huge terrifyingly fierce German Shepherd that he had either found or raised, but all I know is everyone crossed to the other side of the street when that dog was out front of his brownstone, even though there was a metal fence and it was chained. But the main thing with Teddy was that every July 4th he would completely fill the trunk of his Corvette with firecrackers of all kinds. He used to stand there and let the Ladifingers go off in his hand, which was scary, but not crazy, and he'd light the normal firecrackers that you definitely didn't want going off in your hand and he'd hold them for 3 or 4 or 5 seconds and then toss it away with a laugh just as it exploded. He'd do the same thing with cherry bombs that could blow your fingers off. We were amazed, but then eventually he'd bring out the heavy artillery, something that was called a blockbuster that was supposedly equal to half stick of dynamite. When he lit that thing even he ran away, and you can be sure that if Teddy was running everyone else was running too. The thing left cracks all along the street. Then everyone went over to the schoolyard where he was going to light off a battery that was supposed to be more like 1 full stick or dynamite or 2, but I was too young and, quite smartly, my parents sent me to bed, so I never saw that. Overall I'm sure he was a thug of some kind and we all were scared of him, but also loved the crazy energy he brought to the block. This isn't necessarily in line with your question, but whenever something about the Mayfair comes up, I think of this story. So freshman year of high school, I dated this girl who told me that one of her great uncles was a super notorious member of the Mayfair in Las Vegas. Could have been somewhere else out west, but I'm pretty sure LV. A few years after we broke up, I was watching my boy Zach Baggins on Ghost Adventures. They were investigating a place that was supposedly haunted by a mob boss. When they said the guy's name, it was the same last name of my ex. So I texted her and asked what his first name was. Sure enough, it was him. If you are interested, The Mayfair Kills Only in Summer is an Italian movie about a kid growing up in 1970s in Palermo, where Mayfair was subtly influencing everyday lives, even if everyone pretends that nothing was happening. You can find it on Netflix. It's pretty funny, but serious, a great film overall.